Clara Bennett stood on the weathered wooden platform of the small railway station with one worn leather suitcase at her feet, wondering whether fear could make a person's heart stop before death ever arrived. The hot Arizona wind carried dust across the tracks, catching the hem of her pale blue traveling dress as if even the desert wanted to pull her back toward the life she was leaving behind. It was the spring of 1884, and nothing about the morning felt hopeful. Just 3 days earlier, she had buried her father on the family ranch nestled against the rolling hills outside Prescott. The little house where she had grown up now stood silent, its front porch empty without the old rocking chair where Samuel Bennett had spent countless evenings watching the sunset paint the mountains gold. Before he died, he had asked one final thing of his only daughter. It was not a request she had expected. It was a promise he had made nearly 20 years earlier. A promise she now carried alone. Her fingers tightened around the folded letter tucked safely inside her pocket. The paper had already become soft from being unfolded so many times. She knew every word by heart, yet she still felt compelled to read it again. My dearest Clara, if you are reading this, then I have gone where your mother waits for me. Years ago, a brave Apache man saved my life after an ambush. Without him, you would never have been born. I swore that our families would always protect one another. His son, Dakota, has honored that promise all these years. If you choose to fulfill my word, know this above all else. Judge him by his heart, not by the stories fearful people tell. She slowly folded the letter. Judge him by his heart. The words sounded simple. Living them felt impossible. For as long as Clara could remember, travelers passing through town had filled the air with frightening tales about Apache warriors. Around every campfire there seemed to be another exaggerated story. Children were warned not to wander because the Apaches will come. Newspapers printed dramatic headlines that painted every native warrior as savage and merciless. Clara had never actually met one. Everything she knew came from frightened voices. Now she was expected to marry one. A wagon stopped beside the station. An elderly rancher climbed down and tipped his hat respectfully. You must be Miss Bennett. She nodded. I'm Walter Hayes. Your father asked me years ago that if this day ever came, I'd see you safely to Red Mesa. She climbed into the wagon without another word. The journey lasted nearly 2 days. The land slowly changed around them. The scattered farms disappeared. Wide valleys stretched beneath endless skies. Towering red cliffs rose from the desert floor like ancient guardians. Cactus blossoms added surprising splashes of color among the dry earth, while hawks circled high above searching for prey. Walter noticed Clara staring quietly through the wagon. Beautiful country, he said. She smiled faintly. It is. He hesitated before speaking again. You're scared. She laughed softly. I think anyone would be. Walter nodded. Fair enough. After another mile he added quietly, I've traded with Dakota's people for almost 15 years. She looked toward him immediately. They've never harmed you? He chuckled. Quite the opposite. Her surprise showed plainly. They've rescued lost travelers. Shared water during droughts. Returned cattle that wandered onto their land. Then why does everyone fear them? Walter sighed deeply. Because fear travels faster than truth. Those words stayed with Clara for the rest of the journey. Late on the second afternoon they reached Red Mesa. The Apache settlement rested peacefully beside a narrow river lined with cottonwood trees. Children laughed as they chased one another through the grass. Women prepared meals over open fires while elders sat beneath shaded shelters weaving baskets and telling stories. Nothing resembled the terrifying images Clara had imagined. No one shouted. No one threatened her. Instead, curious smiles greeted the newcomer. Several women approached first. One older woman gently placed her hand over Clara's and spoke softly in her own language before smiling warmly. Walter translated. She says you're welcome here. Clara whispered a quiet thank you. Moments later the crowd gradually stepped aside. A tall man walked toward them. His broad shoulders and confident stride immediately caught Clara's attention, yet there was nothing boastful about him. His dark hair was tied neatly behind him, and his buckskin clothing was clean but simple. A carved eagle pendant rested against his chest. His eyes met hers. They were calm, steady, kind. This was Dakota. He stopped several feet away, giving her plenty of space. For several long seconds neither of them spoke. Finally he inclined his head respectfully. My father spoke often of Samuel Bennett. His voice was deep but gentle. He was an honorable man. Clara swallowed her nervousness. He spoke highly of your family too. Dakota nodded once. I am sorry for your loss. No rehearsed speech. No attempt to impress her. Only sincere sympathy. It caught her completely off guard. He noticed the exhaustion in her face. You have traveled far. She nodded. Yes. There is fresh water prepared if you wish to wash. Again he waited rather than assuming. Everything about him seemed patient. Everything about him gave her room to choose. As the evening sun dipped behind the red cliffs, members of both families gathered for the simple wedding promised so many years ago. There were no grand decorations or expensive celebrations, only witnesses, quiet prayers, and two people brought together by a promise neither had made themselves. After the ceremony, Clara followed Dakota toward the small wooden cabin that would now be their home. Her heartbeat grew louder with every step. She knew what most marriages expected after the wedding. Inside the cabin, a single lantern cast warm light across handmade furniture and colorful woven blankets. Dakota placed her suitcase beside the bed. He turned toward her but kept a respectful distance. Clara's hands trembled. Tears filled her eyes before she could stop them. I'm trying, she whispered. I truly am. Her voice cracked. But I'm afraid. The room became perfectly still. Dakota looked at her not with disappointment, but with understanding. Without taking another step closer, he lifted a folded blanket from a nearby chair and gently draped it around her shoulders. Then he smiled with quiet reassurance. You are safe here. He walked toward the cabin door. I will sleep outside tonight. Clara stared at him in disbelief. You don't have to fear me, he said softly. When your heart is ready, it will tell us both. The door closed gently behind him. Wrapped in the blanket, Clara sat alone in the quiet cabin, listening to the soft evening breeze. For the first time since her father's death, her tears no longer came from fear alone. They came from the unexpected kindness of the man she had believed she should fear most. The first rays of morning sunlight slipped through the small cabin window, painting golden lines across the wooden floor. Clara awoke slowly, confused for a moment about where she was. Then the memories of the previous day returned, the long journey, the quiet wedding, and the gentle Apache husband who had chosen to sleep outside rather than frighten her. She looked toward the bed. The other side remained untouched. For reasons she could not explain, a wave of relief mixed with guilt settled over her heart. She wrapped a shawl around her shoulders and quietly stepped outside. The village was already alive. Smoke curled upward from cooking fires, children chased one another between the lodges, and several men prepared their horses for the day's work. Women laughed together while grinding corn, their easy conversations filling the cool morning air. Near the edge of the cabin, Dakota was kneeling beside a small fire, heating coffee in a blackened tin pot. He looked up as Clara approached. Good morning. His voice carried the same calm warmth as it had the night before. Good morning, she replied, still uncertain. He handed her a steaming cup. I wasn't sure how you take it. She accepted it carefully. Thank you. They stood in comfortable silence for several moments, watching the sunrise spread across the red cliffs. Clara had expected awkwardness after the wedding night, but Dakota behaved as though nothing unusual had happened. He neither avoided her nor pressed her into conversation. Finally he spoke. "I'll be riding to check the western grazing lands today." She nodded politely. "I'll return before sunset." Again, there was no expectation that she accompany him or remain at his side. "You are free to spend the day however you wish," he added. "My aunt, Nita, said she would enjoy showing you around the village if you'd like." Clara hesitated before answering. "I think I'd like that." A gentle smile crossed his face. "I think she would too." With that, Dakota saddled his horse, tipped his head respectfully toward her, and rode into the desert with several other warriors. Clara watched until they disappeared among the distant mesas. "He is exactly like his father." The voice belonged to an elderly woman carrying a woven basket. Clara recognized her as the woman who had welcomed her the previous afternoon. "Nita." The woman smiled. "So he remembered to tell you my name." Clara smiled faintly. "He did." Nita motioned for Clara to walk beside her. As they wandered through the village, Clara found herself surprised again and again. Children attended morning lessons beneath a large cottonwood tree, where an elder taught them stories of their ancestors and lessons about respecting the land. Young girls learned weaving from their grandmothers. Several boys practiced carving wooden toys rather than weapons. Everyone seemed busy, but no one appeared hurried. There was a rhythm to village life that felt peaceful. "I imagined something very different," Clara admitted quietly. Nita chuckled. "Many visitors do." They stopped beside a small vegetable garden where beans, squash, and corn grew together. "You thought we spent every day fighting." Clara lowered her eyes. "I suppose I did." Nita knelt to pull a few weeds. "A warrior protects life," she said softly. "He does not spend his days searching for reasons to destroy it." Those words lingered in Clara's mind. Later that afternoon, Nita invited Clara to help bake flatbread over hot stones. The women laughed as Clara accidentally dropped one piece into the ashes. One little girl giggled. "It's only extra smoky now." Even Clara laughed. For the first time in weeks, the sound felt natural. When the sun finally began sinking behind the mountains, horses appeared along the western trail. Dakota returned exactly when he promised. His first glance searched only for Clara. When he saw her smiling beside the cooking fire, his shoulders relaxed almost imperceptibly. "How was your day?" he asked. She surprised herself by answering honestly. "Better than I expected." He smiled. "I'm glad." Nothing more. No questions. No demands. That evening they shared supper with several families beneath the stars. Clara noticed how respectfully everyone treated Dakota. Children eagerly greeted him, elders welcomed his opinions, and every conversation carried genuine affection rather than fear. Leadership, she realized, was something he had earned. Days slowly became weeks. A comfortable routine formed between them. Each morning Dakota worked with the horses or rode patrol across the valley. Clara helped Nita in the gardens, learned Apache words, and gradually became familiar with customs that once seemed mysterious. In return, she taught several children how to read simple English words from the worn Bible she had carried from home. Soon laughter often echoed from the cabin they shared. One evening Clara attempted to cook one of her mother's favorite stews. The result was nearly inedible. Dakota tasted a spoonful. He paused thoughtfully. Clara covered her face. "You don't have to pretend." He smiled with perfect seriousness. "I've eaten worse." She burst into laughter. "You're lying." He nodded. "A little." That became one of their favorite stories. Another afternoon, Dakota invited Clara to ride with him into the hills. She hesitated. "I've never been very good on horseback." "Neither was I," he answered. She blinked. "You." "When I was 6. She laughed again. The ride was slow. Whenever the trail became steep, Dakota rode beside her rather than ahead, quietly encouraging without making her feel incapable. At the top of a ridge they overlooked miles of desert glowing beneath the evening sun. "It feels endless," Clara whispered. "It teaches patience," Dakota replied. She looked toward him. "How?" "The desert cannot be rushed." His words seemed to carry another meaning. She wondered if he had spoken about more than the land. As summer settled over the valley, Clara noticed something unexpected. Whenever Dakota left on longer patrols, she found herself watching the horizon until he returned. She worried if storms rolled across the mountains. She smiled without realizing it whenever she heard his horse approaching. One evening, as they sat quietly outside their cabin watching the stars emerge one by one, Clara finally broke the silence. "May I ask you something?" "Of course." "Why have you never pressured me?" Dakota looked toward the fire before answering. "My father taught me that trust is like a wild bird." She listened carefully. "If you chase it, it flies away." "And if you wait?" she asked. A soft smile touched his face. "Sometimes it chooses your hand." Clara felt her heart beat a little faster. For the first time since arriving at Red Mesa, she realized she was no longer counting the days since the wedding. Instead, she was quietly hoping for many more beside the patient man who had shown her that real strength was measured not by force, but by the kindness to wait. Summer slowly gave way to early autumn, and with each passing week the land around Red Mesa changed color. The cottonwood leaves along the river turned shades of gold, the evenings grew cooler, and the desert wind carried the scent of approaching harvest. Life had settled into a peaceful rhythm. Every morning, Clara and Dakota shared breakfast before beginning their separate work. He inspected horses, met with tribal elders, or rode across the valley to check distant grazing grounds. Clara spent her days teaching children to read, helping Nita gather herbs, and learning the traditions that had once seemed so unfamiliar. Without either of them noticing exactly when it happened, strangers had become friends. Friends had quietly become something more. One afternoon, while Clara was repairing a torn shirt outside their cabin, a little Apache girl named Ayanna skipped toward her carrying a basket of wildflowers. "For you," the child said with a bright smile. Clara accepted them gratefully. "They're beautiful." Ayanna tilted her head. "My grandmother says flowers grow where people are happy." Clara laughed softly. "I hope she's right." The little girl looked toward Dakota, who was mending a saddle beneath a nearby tree. "You're happy now?" It was not a question. Before Clara could answer, Ayanna ran off to join the other children. Clara glanced across the yard. Dakota was completely focused on his work, unaware of the conversation. Still, the little girl's words echoed in her thoughts. She was happy. It surprised her to admit it, even to herself. Months earlier she had arrived expecting to survive an unwanted marriage. Instead, she had found peace. That evening, after supper, Dakota led Clara up a familiar trail overlooking the valley. They often came there to watch the sunset, saying little and simply enjoying the quiet together. The cliffs glowed deep orange beneath the fading light. "It never looks the same twice," Clara whispered. Dakota smiled. "Neither do people." She looked at him. "I judged you before I knew you. You judged the stories you had heard. I'm ashamed of that." He gently shook his head. "Fear teaches many lessons." "And patience?" He looked toward the horizon. "Patience teaches better ones." His answer made Clara smile. She realized that every important lesson she had learned since arriving at Red Mesa had come not through words, but through Dakota's quiet example. As darkness settled over the valley, she reached for his hand. It was the first time she had done so without hesitation. He looked at her with gentle surprise but did not squeeze too tightly. He simply held her hand as though it were the most natural thing in the world. For Clara, it felt like crossing a bridge she had once believed impossible. That night, as they returned to their cabin, Clara paused at the doorway. Her heart beat faster than it had on their wedding night. But this time, it was not because of fear. It was because she had finally made a decision of her own. She stepped inside and turned toward Dakota. "I don't want us to keep living as though we're strangers." He remained silent, giving her room to continue. "I married you because of a promise." She smiled gently. "But I stay because I choose to." Emotion flickered across Dakota's face. It was the closest she had ever seen him come to losing his calm. He walked toward her slowly. "If this isn't what you truly want." She interrupted with a small shake of her head. "It is." He reached out carefully, brushing a loose strand of hair away from her face. His touch was so gentle that it nearly brought tears to her eyes. There was no urgency. No pressure. Only affection. They embraced for the first time as husband and wife, holding one another quietly while the lantern flickered beside them. Later, as they tried to take the next step in their marriage, both quickly realized that real life was nothing like the romantic stories Clara had secretly imagined as a girl. She became nervous. Everything felt unfamiliar. Embarrassment replaced confidence almost immediately. Finally, she pulled back, laughing nervously through tears. "I'm making a complete mess of this." Dakota smiled reassuringly. "I think we're both learning." She looked down, cheeks burning. After a long moment, she spoke in almost a whisper. "It hurts." The words were barely audible. She took a slow breath before continuing. "Maybe, let's try again tonight." Dakota studied her face for a moment. Then, to her surprise, he smiled warmly and sat beside her instead of moving closer. "There is no race," he said softly. She blinked. "What?" "We have our whole lives." She looked at him in confusion. "I don't want you to do anything because you think you must." His voice remained calm. "I would rather spend tonight talking beside you than have you remember this day with fear." Clara felt tears gathering again. Not from pain. Not from disappointment. But from relief. No one had ever treated her feelings with such respect. Dakota poured 2 cups of warm herbal tea and handed one to her. For the next several hours, they talked as they never had before. She shared childhood memories of chasing chickens around her father's ranch. He told stories about learning to track deer with his father. She confessed that she had once believed Apache warriors never smiled. He laughed. "My cousins would find that very amusing." She admitted she had nearly run away before their wedding. He confessed that he had feared she would. They laughed until the cabin echoed with warmth instead of uncertainty. As the fire burned lower, Clara rested her head against his shoulder. "I think I understand something now," she whispered. "What is that?" "I thought love came after marriage." Dakota looked at her. "And now?" She smiled. "I think trust comes first." He kissed the top of her forehead. "I believe you're right." Outside, the desert wind moved gently through the cottonwood trees. Inside the small cabin, nothing remarkable happened by the standards of dramatic stories. There were no grand speeches. No impossible promises. Only 2 people choosing patience over pressure, kindness over expectation, and friendship as the strongest foundation for lasting love. For Clara, that quiet evening became the moment she truly became Dakota's wife, not because tradition demanded it, but because her heart had finally caught up with the promise that had brought her to Red Mesa months before. The peaceful days of autumn could not last forever. Nearly a year had passed since Clara had arrived at Red Mesa. The little cabin that had once felt unfamiliar had become a true home. The shelves now held jars of dried herbs beside her mother's old cookbook. Dakota's saddle rested near the doorway, while Clara's books filled a handmade wooden cabinet he had built for her during the winter. Their lives had blended together naturally, just as the nearby river joined 2 streams into one. The friendship between the Apache community and neighboring ranchers had also grown stronger. Families traded cattle, vegetables, leather goods, and woven blankets. Children from both communities often played together, paying little attention to the differences that adults had once feared. Clara believed the hardest part of her journey was behind her. She was wrong. One chilly October morning, a cloud of dust appeared along the eastern road. Several riders approached Red Mesa. Dakota immediately noticed something unusual. "They're not traders," he said quietly. The men rode with stiff confidence, each carrying polished rifles that gleamed beneath the morning sun. Their expensive coats and spotless boots looked strangely out of place in the dusty frontier. Leading them was a man Clara recognized instantly. Her smile disappeared. "Ethan." Dakota looked toward her. "You know him?" Clara nodded slowly. "He was supposed to become my husband." Months before her father's death, Ethan Mercer had courted Clara with expensive gifts and polished manners. Many people in Prescott believed they would eventually marry. Only Clara knew the truth. Ethan loved the Bennett ranch far more than he had ever loved her. When Samuel Bennett refused to sell the property, Ethan's charm had slowly turned into quiet bitterness. After her father's funeral, Clara had disappeared to fulfill the old promise between their families. Apparently, Ethan had finally found her. The riders stopped just outside the village. Ethan removed his hat with an exaggerated smile. "Clara." She stepped forward calmly. "Ethan. I've come to take you home." "I am home." His smile faded slightly. "I understand you've been frightened." "I haven't." He glanced toward Dakota with obvious disapproval. "You don't have to pretend anymore." Dakota remained silent. Clara noticed his hands resting peacefully at his sides rather than near the hunting knife on his belt. She admired his self-control. "I'm not pretending," Clara answered firmly. "I was told these people forced you into marriage." "No one forced me." Ethan laughed. "You expect me to believe that?" "I expect you to listen." For the first time since arriving, Clara's voice carried the confidence of someone who knew exactly where she belonged. "I chose to stay." Several of Ethan's companions exchanged uncertain glances. That answer clearly wasn't what they expected. Ethan's expression hardened. "I've already spoken with the county marshal." Clara frowned. "What do you mean?" "He believes you've been held against your will." Dakota finally spoke. "Has the marshal met Clara?" "No." "Then perhaps he should ask her before deciding." Ethan ignored him completely. Instead, he pulled a folded document from his saddlebag. "I also have legal claim to the Bennett ranch." Clara's eyes widened. "That's impossible. Your father owed me money." "He did no such thing. The paperwork says otherwise." Clara reached for the document, but Ethan folded it again before she could examine it. Dakota watched carefully without raising his voice. "We will examine those papers together." "You have no authority here," Ethan replied sharply. "I have responsibility here." The distinction was clear. Dakota wasn't interested in power. He was protecting his people. Ethan leaned closer to Clara. "You belong with your own kind." The words echoed through the silent gathering. Before Clara could answer, Nita stepped beside her. "So does she." The elderly woman gently placed a hand on Clara's shoulder. "Our kind is anyone who chooses kindness." More villagers quietly gathered behind them. Several neighboring ranchers, who had arrived earlier to trade supplies, also watched the confrontation. One of them was Walter Hayes. The same rancher who had driven Clara to Red Mesa almost a year earlier. Walter stepped forward. "I've seen this woman happier here than she ever was back in Prescott." Ethan frowned. "You've been deceived." Walter folded his arms. "No. I've been paying attention." Another rancher nodded. "So have we." The support surprised Clara. Fear had once divided these communities. Now they stood together. Unable to persuade anyone, Ethan mounted his horse once more. This isn't over. He turned his horse toward Prescott. The marshal will settle this. As the riders disappeared into the distance, silence settled over the valley. Clara released a slow breath she hadn't realized she had been holding. "I'm sorry," she whispered. Dakota looked at her with gentle confusion. "For what?" "For bringing trouble here." He smiled softly. "You didn't bring trouble." He glanced toward the dusty trail. "Some people carry it wherever they go." Despite his calm words, Clara noticed concern in his eyes. That evening, the tribal council gathered beneath the large cottonwood tree. Several neighboring ranchers were invited as well. It was the first joint meeting between both communities. Everyone understood the danger. If Ethan convinced government officials that Clara had been kidnapped, soldiers might arrive. Fear could undo years of growing trust. After listening quietly to every opinion, Dakota finally stood. "We will not prepare for war." Some younger warriors looked surprised. "They may attack us," one argued. "They may. Then why wait?" Dakota looked around the circle. "Because once violence begins, truth becomes difficult to hear." The elders nodded in agreement. "We defend ourselves only if there is no other choice." Clara watched him with admiration. Months earlier, she had believed courage meant fighting. Now she understood something deeper. Real courage often meant refusing to strike first. Later that night, as she and Dakota walked home beneath a sky filled with stars, Clara slipped her hand into his. "I'm not afraid anymore," she said quietly. He looked at her. "Of Ethan?" She smiled and shook her head. "Of losing the life I chose." Dakota gently squeezed her hand. "We'll face whatever comes. Together." He smiled. "Always." Ahead of them, the warm light from their cabin glowed against the cool desert darkness. Neither of them knew what Ethan was planning next. But one thing had changed forever. The frightened young bride who had arrived at Red Mesa believing only the worst stories was gone. In her place stood a confident woman prepared to defend not only her husband, but the family, community, and love she had freely chosen. The news spread across the Arizona territory faster than the winter wind. A county marshal, accompanied by a dozen deputies, was riding toward Red Mesa. Some said they had orders to remove Clara from the Apache village. Others believed they intended to seize the surrounding land as well. By sunrise, both the settlers and the Apache community understood that the peace they had spent years building was about to face its greatest test. Young warriors sharpened hunting knives and checked their bows. Several ranchers quietly loaded their rifles, preparing to defend their homes if necessary. The air felt heavy with uncertainty. Inside the council lodge, Dakota stood before the gathered families. His calm voice filled the room. "No one fires the first shot." A young warrior named Chaska stepped forward. "But if they come to arrest you?" Dakota met his eyes. "Then they arrest me." The room fell silent. "We will not become the story they expect us to become." The elders nodded. They understood. If violence erupted, newspapers would never print the whole truth. They would simply blame the Apache. Dakota refused to give anyone that excuse. Clara watched him with growing admiration. Months earlier, she had mistaken patience for weakness. Now she realized it required far greater strength than anger ever could. Later that morning, Walter Hayes rode into the village at full speed. His horse was covered in dust. "I've been to Prescott," he called as he dismounted. "What happened?" Clara asked. Walter reached into his saddlebag and removed several folded papers. "I visited the courthouse." Dakota looked at him carefully. "You found something?" Walter nodded. "I found the man who prepared your father's property records." Clara's heart raced. "And? He never signed the documents Ethan showed you." Clara frowned. Then they're fake. Exactly. Walter unfolded one yellowed ledger. The real records are here. Everyone gathered closer. The official documents clearly showed that Samuel Bennett had left the ranch entirely to Clara. There was no debt. No sale. No agreement with Ethan Mercer. Only a forged signature on the papers Ethan carried. Clara looked up. Can we prove it? Walter smiled. We already have. He pointed toward the road. The county clerk is riding here himself. By noon, another group of riders appeared. This time, the county marshal rode beside the elderly clerk, who carried the original land records inside a locked leather case. Ethan Mercer followed confidently behind them, wearing the satisfied smile of a man certain he had already won. The riders stopped in the center of the valley. The marshal stepped forward. I've received reports that Miss Clara Bennett is being held here against her will. Before anyone else could speak, Clara calmly walked forward. No one is holding me. The marshal looked surprised. You are free to answer honestly. I just did. He studied her face. Are you asking to leave? She smiled gently. No. She reached for Dakota's hand. I'm asking to stay. A quiet murmur spread through the crowd. The marshal turned toward Ethan. You told me she was imprisoned. Ethan shifted uneasily. She's afraid to admit it. Clara shook her head. I'm afraid of only one thing. Everyone looked toward her. I'm afraid that lies will destroy the peace we've built. The county clerk stepped forward carrying the leather case. I believe these may help. He carefully opened the documents before the marshal. One by one, he compared the official records with Ethan's papers. His expression quickly darkened. These signatures don't match. He looked directly at Ethan. This deed is forged. The marshal frowned. Are you certain? I prepared the originals myself. Walter Hayes stepped beside the clerk. I witnessed Samuel Bennett sign these records years ago. Several neighboring ranchers nodded. So did we. The evidence became impossible to ignore. Ethan's confidence vanished. He pointed angrily toward Dakota. They tricked all of you. No, the marshal replied firmly. It appears you attempted to trick us. The deputies quietly moved toward Ethan. His face turned pale. This is a misunderstanding. The marshal held out his hand. Give me your weapon. For a brief moment, everyone held their breath. Some feared Ethan might reach for his revolver. Others feared the deputies would open fire. Dakota remained perfectly still. He did not move toward Ethan. He did not encourage his warriors to surround him. Instead, he simply waited. After several tense seconds, Ethan slowly surrendered his pistol. The deputies placed him under arrest for forgery, fraud, and attempting to obtain property through false claims. As they led him away, Ethan turned toward Clara. You chose them over your own people. Clara answered quietly. No. She looked around at the settlers standing beside Apache families. I chose people who became my family. Silence followed her words. Then something unexpected happened. The county marshal removed his hat and faced Dakota. I owe you an apology. Dakota inclined his head respectfully. You came seeking the truth. I came expecting trouble. He looked across the peaceful gathering. I found honorable people instead. The marshal extended his hand. After a brief pause, Dakota shook it. The simple gesture carried enormous meaning. For the first time, many people present saw a government officer publicly acknowledge an Apache leader with respect rather than suspicion. The tension that had filled the valley slowly disappeared. Children began laughing again. Women resumed preparing the midday meal. Several ranchers and Apache warriors worked together to unload supplies from wagons that had been forgotten during the confrontation. Peace had survived. That evening, the entire community gathered beneath the great cottonwood tree. Long wooden tables were filled with fresh bread, roasted venison, beans, vegetables, and fruit pies brought by neighboring ranch families. Music drifted through the cool evening air. Children danced together without caring who had been born in a ranch house or a village lodge. As the stars appeared overhead, Walter Hayes raised a tin cup. "A year ago," he said, smiling toward Clara, "I drove a frightened young woman to Red Mesa." Laughter spread gently through the crowd. Walter continued. "Today I watched that same woman remind all of us that courage doesn't always ride into battle." He looked toward Dakota. "Sometimes courage simply refuses to start one." Everyone lifted their cups. Dakota smiled modestly. Clara slipped her hand into his beneath the table. She remembered the frightened bride who had whispered through tears on her first night in the little cabin. She barely recognized that young woman anymore. Patience had given her confidence. Kindness had given her strength. And love, built slowly through trust, had protected everything fear once threatened to destroy. The greatest victory that day had not been winning the ranch or exposing Ethan's lies. It had been proving that understanding, honesty, and quiet courage could accomplish what violence never could. 5 years passed as quietly as the seasons. The Arizona desert remained as beautiful as ever, with red cliffs glowing beneath the morning sun and endless skies stretching across the horizon. Yet much had changed in the valley where fear had once divided neighbors. The peace that Clara and Dakota had fought to protect had taken root. Where there had once been suspicion, there was now friendship. Where there had once been silence, there was laughter. The little cabin that had welcomed Clara as a frightened bride had grown into a warm family home. A wide porch overlooked the river, climbing roses framed the front door, and a large cottonwood tree shaded the yard. Most afternoons, the sound of children's laughter echoed through the valley. One bright spring morning, Clara stood outside ringing a small brass bell. "School is starting." Within minutes, children came running from every direction. Some wore buckskin clothing decorated with careful beadwork. Others arrived in simple ranch shirts and worn boots. To Clara, none of those differences mattered anymore. She welcomed every child with the same warm smile. Inside the small schoolhouse, English books rested beside Apache story scrolls. Maps hung next to traditional artwork. Every lesson reminded the children that learning another person's history never erased their own. Clara believed education could build bridges where fear once built walls. Meanwhile, Dakota had become one of the most respected leaders in the territory. Each morning he taught the older boys and girls practical skills that every frontier family needed. He showed them how to track deer without disturbing the land. He explained how to read changing weather from the clouds. He taught them to care for horses with patience instead of force. "The strongest rider," he often said, "is the one whose horse trusts him." The children quickly realized he was speaking about more than horses. Many neighboring ranchers now sought Dakota's advice whenever disagreements arose. He rarely solved problems by giving orders. Instead, he listened. Then he asked questions that helped others discover their own answers. Even the county marshal visited several times each year. Their first meeting had begun with suspicion. Now it always ended with shared coffee on the cabin porch. One afternoon, Walter Hayes arrived carrying exciting news. "The railroad company has approved the new station." Clara smiled brightly. "Really?" Walter nodded. "It'll bring supplies, teachers, doctors, and new families." Dakota looked thoughtfully toward the valley. "Then we'll need a larger school." Clara laughed. "I was hoping you'd say that." The entire community joined together over the following months. Apache craftsmen cut timber from nearby forests. Ranchers hauled stone from the hills. Women prepared meals for every volunteer. Children proudly carried water and gathered nails, insisting they were helping build the future. Before winter arrived, a beautiful new schoolhouse stood near the river. Its entrance displayed a simple wooden sign. Knowledge grows best where respect is shared. The words reflected everything Clara and Dakota believed. One crisp autumn evening, after the day's lessons had ended, Clara and Dakota sat together on the porch watching the sunset. Two young children played nearby. Their son, Samuel, named after Clara's father, carefully helped his younger sister, Lily, stack smooth river stones into tiny towers. When the towers tumbled over, both children burst into laughter instead of tears. "They're growing fast," Clara said softly. Dakota smiled. "So are we." She leaned against his shoulder. "Do you remember our first night here?" He laughed quietly. "I remember sleeping outside." She smiled. "I remember believing you were the most frightening man I would ever meet. And now?" She reached for his hand. "Now I can't imagine life without you." Dakota looked toward the fading sunlight. "I wasn't patient because I was certain you would love me." She turned to him with curiosity. "You weren't?" He shook his head. "I was patient because love cannot be demanded." Clara felt tears gathering in her eyes. Even after all these years, his quiet wisdom still touched her heart. Just then, Samuel ran onto the porch. "Papa." Dakota lifted the laughing boy into his arms. "Can you tell us another story tonight?" "What kind?" "The one about how you met Mama." Dakota smiled knowingly. "I think your mother tells that story better." Samuel immediately turned toward Clara. She laughed. "I suppose I do." The children settled at her feet as the first stars appeared overhead. Clara looked across the valley before beginning. "When I first came here," she said, "I thought courage meant never being afraid." Samuel frowned. "Didn't you feel scared?" "Oh, very scared." Lily climbed into her mother's lap. "Then what changed?" Clara looked lovingly toward Dakota. "I met a man who taught me that real courage is being kind when you have the power not to be." She smiled warmly. "He showed me that trust grows slowly, like a strong tree. You can't force it to grow faster. You simply care for it every day." The children listened quietly. Samuel looked up at his father. "So that's why everyone respects you?" Dakota chuckled. "I hope they respect the choices we make together." Clara nodded. "That's the secret." As darkness settled gently across Red Mesa, neighbors gathered around small campfires, sharing songs, meals, and stories. The valley that had once been divided by fear had become a place where two cultures lived side by side with mutual respect. Travelers passing through often asked Clara the same question. "Were you ever afraid to marry an Apache warrior?" She always smiled before answering. "Yes." Then she would glance toward Dakota, who was usually helping a child saddle a horse or repairing a neighbor's fence. "But fear tells you who you think someone is." She paused thoughtfully. "Patience gives you the chance to discover who they truly are." The frightened young bride who had whispered through tears on her wedding night could scarcely have imagined the life waiting ahead. The greatest gift Dakota had ever given her was not a home, land, or security. It was time. Time to trust. Time to heal. Time to choose love freely. And together, they proved that the strongest marriages are never built on fear or haste, but on patience, respect, kindness, and the quiet courage to let love grow at its own perfect pace.